The demonstrations on college campuses around the country are continuing. And not only are they continuing, but they are spreading. They're becoming more massive, more involved. The university administrations don't know what the hell to do. This whole situation is being worked like a bicycle pump by the Trump election campaign. The old saying in politics, never let a crisis go unused. And this is what the Trump campaign is doing. And Trump is promising that he'll bring an end to this. All this disruption, all of this upset, all of this, all the demonstrations, all the alleged anti-Semitism, all the alleged anti-Muslim, pro-Israel, pro-Gaza, pro-this, anti-that. Mr. Trump will bring it all to an end, he's claiming. Now, let me make an historical reference here. In 1968, this country truly exploded. I can remember I was afraid every single day that the republic was going to fall. We had 2 assassinations of political leaders, Dr. King, Robert Kennedy, the Attorney General, who was running for president. We had the Democratic Convention in Chicago that resulted in a police riot where hundreds, if not thousands, of people were beaten to a pulp by police nightsticks. We had cities burning in this country as an aftermath to the assassination of Dr. King. The country was really on the verge of chaos, and on all the campuses around the country, there were anti-war demonstrations. There were anti-Democratic Party demonstrations. Students were inflamed, incensed, furious with Lyndon Johnson and Hubert Humphrey. All of these people were considered to be traitors. They were considered to be working against the best interests of the United States because the politicians, with a couple of noted exceptions, favored a continuation of the murder that was going on in Vietnam, favored the use of the attacks against the Black Panther organization. Members of the Black Panthers were being shot dead in their beds. It was a horrifying time. Now, you may not be old enough to have lived through that. I did live through it. I can remember, I was living in Tampa at the time, and I can remember lying in bed on the night of the severe police riots broke out in Chicago against the anti-war demonstrators who were picketing and demonstrating in front of the Democratic National Convention. And as I lay there in bed and watched the demonstrations and the people being beaten, I think CBS News just had cameras all over the place. And this is very unusual in 1968, given the technology that was available then. But as I watched the clubbing of students live on camera, being beaten into the ground, the cops being beaten, but mostly the kids who were protesting, the young people, I shouldn't say kids, damn it, the young people who were protesting. It was horrifying. It was absolutely horrifying. I could not believe that this was happening in my country. I mean, I lived all of my teen years and my young years in the 50s. And such a thing was unthinkable. This kind of rioting in the streets, police brutality, cities burning, people being assassinated, was just fucking horrifying. All of it. And how did the Nixon campaign in 1968, how did they run their campaign? They kept pounding home that the country was exploding. The young people were at fault. The students were at fault. The anti-war protesters were at fault. The Negroes were at fault. The black revolutionaries were at fault. And Nixon promoted that idea to the point where it became, well, like Trump promoting the idea that he's a poor, innocent little babe in the woods who's being horribly picked on by Joe Biden. And people started believing what Nixon was saying. And Nixon was elected president in the middle of all this, even though George McGovern kept warning, if this man is elected, well, the same thing that Hillary Clinton predicted about Donald Trump. So Trump, the people of America decided the only way out of the situation was to elect someone who is promising to crackheads to beat the shit out of anybody who got out of line, which is exactly what Nixon did. 2 years later, he ordered the Ohio National Guard. He federalized the National Guard. I believe it was federalized. And 4 students were shot dead on the Kent State campus in Ohio. I mean, the parallels here. You know, who said it? History may not repeat itself, but it does rhyme. Isn't that what we are seeing right now? And this is my fear. And there's no way to defuse the horrible situations in this country as a result of our support for Israel in the slaughter of innocent Gazans. There's no way to all of a sudden have a huge megaphone and say to all the students, stop protesting. That's not going to happen. It simply is not going to happen. In fact, like I said, it's increasing, this resistance. But here's the awful, horrible byproduct of these student demonstrations. They are going to usher Donald Trump into the presidency. Now, I'm not saying that to put blame on the students. Things are what they are. I have said all along that I support these demonstrations by the students. To the extent that I can say I support it, because I did the same thing back in 1970. I was on the streets in Raleigh, North Carolina when I was a student at NC State. So I know, I understand this. I went to impeach Nixon rallies in D.C. I have been tear gassed as a result. I worked with the, what was called at the time, a real radical group called the Attica Brigade that was totally anti-Nixon. It was impeach Nixon. That was the central theme in 1970. Get this son of a bitch out of here. And in 71 and 72, well, Nixon was reelected, wasn't he? And you can draw your own conclusions about what happened next. It was the most criminal administration in the history of this country, way beyond the crimes that have been committed by Donald Trump. And I'll say committed. I don't give a shit. I'm not on a jury. I'm not a judge. To me, the bastard committed everything he's been charged with. But those were more or less the crimes of Donald Trump are crimes that show the absolute moral vacuum inside Donald Trump. He's a liar, a grifter, a punk, a thug, an asshole. But Richard Nixon was the worst political criminal this country's ever had. I mean, we talk about Johnson ordering 500,000 troops into Vietnam. And Nixon kept that going. But Nixon also ordered governments to be overthrown, heads of state to be assassinated. I mean, it was fucking horrible until he finally resigned. When Republican senators went to Nixon and said, listen, you're going to be impeached and convicted. And Nixon resigned the next day. And then this crazy bastard Gerald Ford pardoned him. So the American public would never fully understand the breadth and depth of the crimes that were committed against this country by Nixon, Haldeman, Ehrlichman, and Dean, and John Mitchell. Those 5 people, I realize John Dean has been exonerated, or not exonerated, but he's gone through the confessional and so on and so forth. But those 4 or 5 people, John Mitchell, the Attorney General, wound up in prison. Those 5 people were key to setting this country on a road to Reagan, the Christian Nazis, and Donald Trump. Hi, Truth Seekers. Mike Malloy here. You know, the Progressive Voices Network brings you commercial-free commentary from today's leading progressive radio hosts and pundits, like me, Mike Malloy, 24 hours a day. I'm not your typical old guy from the 80s or the 90s talk radio host, and Progressive Voices is not your typical talk radio network. It's a listener-supported nonprofit with no corporate control whatsoever over our broadcast. So hosts like me, Mike Malloy, are free to rant and scream and carry on about whatever we like. We're often controversial, but we're never boring. Weeknights, 9 p.m. in the East, 6 p.m. in the West on the Progressive Voices Network. Always progressive, always on. I'm Mike Malloy. Keep it lit.